All right, good afternoon, and thank you for your patience. Welcome to One Community's Point of Pride 2020 Business Inclusion Summit. This is the Youth and Schools Advocacy Panel discussion. I am Nate Rhoton, your moderator today. I'm the Executive Director of 1 in 10, a local nonprofit serving LGBTQ youth and young adults for the last 27 years here in Arizona. With me today, I have an extinguished group of panelists, and I will allow them to introduce themselves. First, with the Honorable Kathy Hoffman, Arizona Superintendent of Public Instructions. Kathy, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel, such a privilege. So you want me to give my background?
Please, yeah, if you will.
Perfect. So my background is I started as a preschool teacher in Tucson, and then I became a speech language pathologist. So I worked for school districts in both Tucson and Phoenix, working in special education. I worked at a Title I school serving some of our most vulnerable students, working with students from diverse backgrounds. Students I worked with typically had a moderate to severe disability, such as autism or Down syndrome. And through my passion for serving my students as an educator, I decided to run for office and feel very fortunate and privileged that I was elected to be state superintendent in November of 2018, and proud to be the youngest woman elected to state office in the country, which I think is important to have that young woman in terms of leading our school community as well.
Interesting fact I did not know about you, and thank you for sharing with us, and I appreciate your leadership, especially during this year. We'll be talking more about the difficulties of that in just a moment. Next, let's go right to Dr. Larry Johnson, President of Phoenix College. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Nate. It is such a pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel. I am Larry Johnson. I have the opportunity to serve and the pleasure to serve as the president of Phoenix College. I have been in this position now since July 1 of 18. It has certainly been a pleasure and an honor to get to know all of the great leaders on this panel and also throughout the greater Phoenix area. I began as an English faculty member many years ago, and I rose through the ranks from faculty to chair to dean, more through the traditional academic route. So certainly happy to be here, happy to provide any insight, happy to contribute to this important conversation today. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Let's go to one of my good friends, Tyler Allen, Esquire, as I like to say. Tyler, thank you for being with us today. Tell us a little bit more about your work here in the Valley.
Sure, thanks, Nate. I moved to Phoenix in 2006 and attended law school at ASU. I graduated in 2009 during a pretty significant recession. My job offer was taken, so I went out on my own and I started my own law firm here in the Valley. We now have 6 attorneys and practice in a variety of areas, but also as a business owner, I think it's very important to give back to the community. We have done a couple of grant programs about 4 years called the Back to School Give Back, where we do grants for teachers for specific projects and necessary items that they want to enact in their classrooms. I've also become pretty passionate about some advocacy work, specifically as a conversion therapy survivor on getting conversion therapy banned in Arizona. So that is something that I'm actively involved in and work closely with Nate and some other organizations here. So I'm very happy to participate.
And thank you, Tyler, for your leadership on that. We will definitely be talking more about that in a moment as well. So the goal of today's panel is to talk about how inclusion impacts our families in Arizona. In recent years, we've seen important movement, such as the repeal of No Promo Homo, a very restrictive law that prevented medically accurate, inclusive sexual health education in our schools. But our LGBTQ youth still face challenges in healthcare, in school, acceptance by their families and communities, and new challenges brought on by COVID-19. So today we are going to talk with some of our champions that you've just met about issues affecting LGBTQ youth and what we can do to ensure our children grow up in an Arizona that celebrates, respects, and protects all people equally. So I'd like to start out with, because it's hard not to, COVID-19. School closures and social distancing have impacted families and students across Arizona, and certainly at 1 in 10, where we've had to go to complete remote programming. What are some of the specific impacts on LGBTQ youth? And Superintendent Hoffman, if you don't mind starting this off, we'd like to hear from you first.
Yeah, I think one thing that's become even more visible during the COVID-19 crisis is that our schools provide critical services for both students and families. That in the past couple of months, our schools have served over 10 million meals. Our teachers have been going above and beyond to check in on the mental health and social well-being of their students. So specifically for our LGBTQ students, like so many of our other students, not being in the classroom means that they are missing out on those critical supports of being in the classroom, of having trusted adults and teachers, having their peers, because we know that for many LGBTQ students, that some, or at least for some, that school might be the place where they feel the safest, where they have those trusted adults that they can turn to, or the counselor, or their clubs, the sports, like all these different social emotional pieces that are so critical, especially during this time when we had school closures and our kids feeling perhaps more isolated, more anxious in this era of uncertainty. So those are the issues that I've been most concerned about, is thinking I'm most worried about the social emotional well-being and those types of services that our schools typically would offer in person.
I think that is so important, because we oftentimes hear of school being a place of where bullying may occur and things of that sort, but equally and certainly much more importantly, it's a safe place for many youth because of the space that's created by some of our fantastic, incredible educators, teachers, as well as the peers that they have in families where youth may not be out to their families, but they can be who they are to their friends, to those special teachers. So that's certainly something that is being missed right now. Thank you, Superintendent Hoffman. From a secondary education standpoint, Dr. Johnson, what have you seen on Phoenix College's campus as it pertains to LGBTQ students?
You know, Nate and Superintendent Hoffman began to really talk about the basic needs of students, but in addition to that as well, it's the digital divide. We know that there are a large number of our LGBTQ plus students who are homeless. So if the students are homeless and they don't have access to technology, and for those, many of them who do have access to technology, there also may be that digital divide in terms of the hotspots and being able to access hotspots so that they can complete their work. And while we tried our best in terms of equity to provide everyone access to laptop loaner programs for many of our students, then we learned that yes, we were able to provide the laptop, but how we're going to have access. So that, to me, that digital divide and closing that gap is something that I believe has not only for all student populations, but certainly like LGBTQ plus students, we know many of the barriers that they face, which is why I really love 1 in 10 and the work that you do, because you support many of those students who, you know, came out to their parents, who now are homeless, and you have that avenue wherein they can have access to those resources. But that's greatly, as I would say, exacerbated now that we're in this pandemic a couple of months ago, and many of those students, where would they go, you know, without those resources? So we've seen at Phoenix College and many of the institutions, how are we going to close that digital divide to really support those students? So that's one of the barriers that we've experienced.
Thank you for that. And the digital divide is so significant right now. At 1 in 10, we've launched an emergency relief fund, and part of that is a technology component where we've been putting Chromebooks, brand new Chromebooks, into the hands of young adults and emancipated minors that need that. But the lack of the internet piece makes them pretty much unusable if they don't have that. So it then causes a whole different set of issues for them. So thank you for that. I'd like to now move over a little bit to something that Dr. Johnson just mentioned, is homelessness. And nearly 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ, very much a disproportionate percentage than the population as a whole. What factors contribute to the statistic, and what can your organizations do to help? And who would like to start with this particular question?
I'm happy to jump in a little bit.
Thank you, Tyler.
Just, you know, I think you see a number of reasons why youth end up homeless, but one of them often is they get kicked out from their families, by their families when they come out. And so that's obviously going to be a struggle when you're young, going through that experience anyway, that emotional experience, and then you're searching for shelter and housing. And thankfully, there's resources such as 1 in 10 and some other resources when you are young, but it's often the unknown of how to get those resources, especially in times like this with COVID. There's dangers out there just being on the streets or being around other people. But something that, as a business owner, I find it necessary to contribute to those types of organizations that provide those types of services. CAS is a great organization that provides, homeless shelter services. And so not only is it as a community and as a business owner trying to donate to those types of organizations, but making sure that others are aware of them and making sure that people within your network, are able to understand what those services are and how they can help, so that, if you come up with somebody who is needing that type of service, you can either put them in touch with someone directly. But also I think there's that need, where do these kids go? Once they're homeless, they're not going to reach out to me. They're not going to reach out to the state superintendent usually, or the president of Phoenix College. So we need to provide those resources where they will actually be looking and where they will actually be going. And so that's why an organization like 1 in 10 and spreading the word amongst the youth, but also potentially, and it's great what you're doing in terms of trying to spread out in rural areas, but looking to where they would maybe go and providing that information to the schools themselves, so that they're aware, hey, these kids who are facing homeless, where can they go?
And thank you for that, Tyler. And as we look at raising awareness of the homelessness issue, I think a lot of folks think that homeless youth and young adults aren't in school. And we know that that's certainly not true. Dr. Johnson, Superintendent Hoffman, any comment there on some of the initiatives being done and raising awareness there?
Nate, that's a good question. I really got excited when I heard Tyler talk about something. And what I've learned is that there is great synergy in partnerships. And what I have observed in some, I would say certain regions and some parts of different organizations I've worked with, is that there are so many silos in terms of, how we support our students and how we support each other. And what we're finding, and what I think COVID-19 has done for us, is that it's caused us to really come together as a collective. And you're finding that organizations who would not have otherwise worked together, they're now coming together for that collective impact. And I think one of the opportunities that post-secondary institutions have is the strength of the partnerships, partnering with 1 in 10, partnering with UMOM, partnering with all of those organizations, wherein when those students do come to our institutions, they know that they can be connected to someone that can help them with their basic needs. So we partner with St. Mary's, and we have a food bank prior to COVID-19, where periodically they would come in and we would have those healthy food items for students and the community. But we also have a great counseling services department. So when students come in and they can have a various needs, and we're able to triage those students by connecting them to our counseling department, so that we can then direct them to those resources. So I think at this time, what this is really showing us is we need to be more engaged in the partnerships in our community. And we also need to really set some goals around, if we're not with a certain organization in terms of being aware of them, it's also awareness as well. And Tyler points that out as well. Many of our students are not aware of these organizations because as leaders, sometimes we are not as intentional about cultivating those partnerships for our greater goods, because sometimes we're only focused on that I would say that micro level, but then at the real macro level of the organization, how are we really meeting the needs of our students? And that's only through, and can be really realized through the strength of our partnerships, especially with our K-12 partners.
And I think we've seen too, where with COVID-19, as Superintendent Hoffman mentioned earlier, the lack of being able to get these critical meals into the lives of our young people, mental health services that Phoenix College or the Community College District are providing to certain degrees, and then certainly in the public schools. Superintendent Hoffman, can you speak a little bit more about that and maybe like McKinney-Vento, and let us know a little bit more about the issue of homelessness as it pertains to youth that are actively going to school in the public school system?
Yeah, I really appreciate that you've elevated this issue, Nate, and that you've made that a priority within 1 in 10 in your work. And I also really loved what Dr. Johnson was just saying about the need for more collaboration around these issues and helping connect our youth to the proper resources that they need. So our department does have, the Department of Education does have a homelessness coordinator, and we wanted to have a meeting with you, Nate, to talk more about how we could partner more closely. So we got to get that back on the calendar.
We had it set for end of March and a little something.
No, I know. Life got a little crazy, but I also want to point to our work around the advocacy work for having more school counselors and social workers in our schools, because through legislation that we helped to get passed last year, as well as new State Board of Education policy also passed last year that made some adjustments on how to get certified as a school counselor. I just actually got an email yesterday updating me that as a result of all of our advocacy work around these policies, in the last year, we have certified over 500 new school counselors. And so I know that's been a huge issue in our schools, is that Arizona's had one of the lowest proportions of school counselor to student in the country. And we've been working to not be at the bottom of that list. And having school counselors and social workers, in addition to the homeless coordinators, the people who are implementing McKinney-Vento in our schools, having those teams of people who are trained professionals and connecting students to resources, providing them with the mental health supports that they need is just, I can't say enough how critical that is for our students. So I'm really proud of the gains we've made over the last year, but we also have so much more work to do in this area, because we know that the need, that when I talk to our school leaders and they say how many more school counselors or social workers they would like to hire, but they don't have the resources or funding, or experiencing those types of challenges in terms of basically because of funding. We need to make sure that we keep getting at the root of that issue to make sure that they have sustainable funding for those types of positions going forward.
I so appreciate you mentioning the school counselors. A good friend of mine, I won't say the high school that she's a counselor for here in the Valley, but last I spoke with her, she had nearly 400 students assigned to her at a very large high school. And to think that she's able to really provide, a sufficient level of care to each of those students is just not realistic. And so we definitely need to double down on our efforts there and our investment. So I appreciate that. I'd also like to remind our participants that are online, we will be using the Q&A feature here in a moment to answer your questions. So if you have additional questions about any of these items, please use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will go through those in a few moments. But first, I want to talk about something that Tyler mentioned in his intro, and that is that we've had multiple failed attempts to ban conversion therapy in Arizona. From each of your unique perspectives, how do we raise awareness and educate our leaders and families about why conversion therapy shouldn't be an option? And I'm gonna let Tyler go first on this one and allow him to educate us on some of the stats that I think maybe all of us on here are well aware of, but and really helps to illustrate how critical this is that we ban this dangerous practice for minors here in the state of Arizona. Tyler?
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, so just a little bit of background. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I was placed into conversion therapy at age 14, and I was in it for 5 years until I was 19. Conversion therapy is the practice of attempting to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And I was placed in it by my religious leader, my bishop. And I went once a week to a licensed professional counselor. And then also once a week was meeting with my bishop. So what we've been trying to do here in Arizona, and has been done successfully in a number of states, it's kind of a new tidal wave of reform, which is desperately needed, is to ban conversion therapy for minors from licensed professionals. And so it's very specific about what that does. But the reason it is so necessary is, I think the most alarming statistic is that 2/3 of youth who go through conversion therapy attempt suicide. We know that suicide is horrible. We know that it is, one of the top leading causes of death for youth nationwide. But there is a great amount of misinformation at the Capitol about what it is, what it does, what the legislation does, and why it would be necessary. So the last several sessions of the state legislature, we've had bills introduced, and this last bill was a bipartisan bill that had some pretty sound support, but there was still some misinformation out there, whether or not it prohibited parents from talking to their children, whether or not it prevented a physician from having a conversation about their sexual orientation or gender identity with the patient. And none of these things are done. And this bill explicitly exempts those because of that the common confusion about what is actually this bill would do. But this bill would save lives. And I think why it's desperately needed is that fact alone, is just the high suicide rate for LGBT youth. And I think in order to get it done, people need to speak out. They need to understand. One of the biggest frustrations for me was, well, I don't know anybody whose kid's in conversion therapy right now. From my experience, my parents didn't even know, actually, until I was 18, that my bishop had put me in there. And a number of parents who place their children in there are not going to come out and say, oh yes, my child's gay, but I'm going to make them straight. Or yes, my child wants to transition, but I'm going to stop that. That doesn't happen. So I think that conversations need to be held. I think that it's great if we can get youth to speak for themselves. It's tough sometimes finding those youth, but the most powerful voice is from an individual who's going through it. So I think we need to empower those youth to have their voices heard, to have elected officials answer to them because they serve them.
And I think one of the interesting pieces that Tyler and I saw firsthand this last legislative session in working on this was that the families that came forward, they felt that this was a family issue. It was the whole family had been impacted by this. And in many cases, as Tyler just noted, the family didn't realize that this is what they were putting their child into. It was cloaked as being something different and not called conversion therapy. So that's why it is so dangerous. And suicide is a problem across our country for our youth. But when you look at LGBTQ youth, it's even more of an issue. And then you add on this conversion therapy layer, and it is a really unfortunate outcome. So given that, Superintendent Hoffman, what are we doing in the schools around suicide prevention specifically? I know at 1 in 10, we do a lot of suicide prevention training, but is that something that the public schools are taking on as well?
Yes, there has been actually a lot of bipartisan support in even just the past year around various types of policies to mandate, for example, training for teachers. That's a new law that all teachers get trained in suicide prevention. That's an area that our department is also very involved in, that we have trainers in the department that go out to schools and can train groups of people. So that's something that can be accessed on our website if people would like more information on requesting those types of trainings. But I do also want to speak to in terms of the question of, well, how do we get it passed? Because I think to me, it also speaks to how much elections matter, and how I loved how Tyler was talking about having students raise their voices to legislators. I would also take that a step further and say those youth should run for office and be on their school boards, be at the local level, go for the state level. Don't let anything limit you. So I just think that it just, to me, also speaks to the fact that how much elections matter and who is representing us does make a huge impact. And preventing suicide and working on suicide prevention policies is something we can all get behind, and there's so much bipartisan support around that. But there's still, if we're still hitting these obstacles and barriers around LGBTQ issues legislatively, I just think, again, how much elections matter.
Thank you, Superintendent Hoffman. And a reminder to everyone, we will be going to a Q&A session soon. So if you have any questions that you'd like to pose for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I love that you mentioned the youth voice, and even as much as encouraging young people to run for office. I think that's fantastic. We certainly see that at 1 in 10 with our Youth Advisory Committee and the unbelievably powerful and intelligent voice that they have. Dr. Johnson, I know that you have some really passionate students at Phoenix College. How have you seen the LGBTQ student voice being used and expressed there on campus?
That's a great question, Nate. One of the, I would say, points of pride in the institution is that we were founded on equity and inclusion in 1920s. And what attracted me to Phoenix College was something I saw on the website when I was applying almost 3 years ago. And that was the point that they were focused on tunnels of oppression. And I didn't know what tunnels of oppression meant until I actually experienced the tunnel of oppression about 2 years ago. And that is where we brought in these pods. And each pod is an experience that the student and or the community leader would go through, and they would understand from those oppressed communities, what they were going through. So one of those pods was about transgender culture, and it helped the audience and the stakeholders to understand, and that's faculty, staff, students, our community leaders, from the mouth of a student who's a trans woman, to understand this is what a day in the life is like for her. And after that experience, there's a counselor that was at the end of that experience to really help people to go through that cathartic experience of what did you learn? How did that make you feel? And what I love about post-secondary education is that students, when they come to a college, they can become anything that they want to be, because we give them that flexibility and we give them that freedom to have those intellectual conversations. We actually have an LGBTQ plus focus organization that is run by our students, and they're actively engaged on the college campus, and we're having those courageous conversations. So from I would say the post-secondary perspective, these are conversations that we have heard many years ago, and it's even more important now. As Tyler mentioned, the disproportionate number of students who are LGBTQ plus who are experiencing this horrific approach to try and convert them. I also argue, when we look at the disproportionate, we disaggregate that data and we look at our students of color, our young men. Just a couple of years ago in Alabama, a young man about 7 or 8 years old hung himself, all right, because he was being taunted and he was being belittled by persons in his class. So we also have to be able to look at that from ethnic persuasions and see, are there different communities that are greater impacted? And then you have to look at it from the perspective of what is then the upbringing, because in some communities, and Tyler points out to this, because I grew up devoutly Pentecostal and very, very religious household. And there are some conversations I could not have because I wasn't comfortable having them with my mother or father, because when I go and sit in front of the pastor or the preacher, there's already this perception that I have to be the preacher's kid. I have to be the evangelist's son. So that scares you away. And when you look at young men of color who are going through these processes of trying to figure out who they are and how they exist in the world, that's a whole nother layer that I don't think oftentimes we are able to get to, even when we're working with our students of color. So I think this is a good opportunity for us to illuminate and highlight these conversations greater. And most importantly, and hopefully we will talk about this, there is a responsibility for our business community to be engaged with our young people, because we're talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic, but we also must invite those CEOs of those various organizations to go to these marginalized communities, like our LGBTQ plus communities, engage with them, because that's the future of work. And that may be going at a whole nother tangent, but I just wanted to put that out there because that's important.
Well, you hit on some really critical topics, and I loved hearing what you mentioned first, which is the work that Phoenix College is doing in, I believe you called them pods. Mm-hmm. And I think that sounds like something that, frankly, the entire population could use. So that's incredibly hopeful to hear that the college is doing that work. And, you know, the LGBTQ community consists of, it's a special community in more ways than one, in that we're a cross-sectionality of so many different communities. So we have young people who are experiencing double marginalization in society, where they are a person of color, they are LGBTQ, and so it's a whole different, set of effects that happen from that, and we're seeing some of that play out now. Kind of one of our final formal questions before we move to Q&A. If anyone has any questions, please post them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. But what do you all wish people knew or accepted about LGBTQ youth? And again, that's what do you wish people knew or accepted about LGBTQ youth? And I would say, just to start off, that I think what I think maybe everyone has hit on in some way, shape, or form or another, is that the youth voice is so important. I would love to see a youth council at Phoenix City Council that could help to give youth input to decisions that are being made, something to that effect. What do you all see in your line of work? And again, what do you wish people knew or accepted about LGBTQ youth?
Nate, one of the things that we have to do is that we have to dismantle that whole perception of the other. Because we say that we have the heteronormative paradigm, and then we have the other. So one of the things that we have to realize is that these young children are someone's sister, they're someone's brother, they're someone's sister, and so on and so forth, however they identify. And when we begin to first look at them as, this could be my brother or my sister or my niece or my nephew, I think that then brings home, that dismantles that whole idea that, okay, this is an other, they are different, they are outside of the heteronormativity. And I think that's one of the things that we have to acknowledge, that young people, they have different experiences, they have different cultural norms. And I think when we identify them and work with them in their authenticity, I think that's one of the first things that we have to do, and not approach them as saying, well, they are labeled as LGBTQ+. I'm not the Black president of Phoenix College. I am the president of Phoenix College, who happens to be Black or African American. And I think once you remove that otherness, from the dialogue, and then look at the person authentically as this is a young man or young woman, however they identify, and then get to the core of how can we now, illuminate that conversation to a certain level to come to a place of understanding what these differences and what all of these varieties and how they can help to contribute to our society. So those are some of the things I would say that we would need to do.
Love that. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Tyler, would you like to go next?
Sure. I love what Dr. Johnson said. Find that common ground, find that common place where you can come together before you dive deeper into what those specific issues are. I think that's so important. I always say, you don't go and ask for a favor with a sword, you ask for a favor with an outstretched hand. I don't know if we'll be outstretching hands anytime soon, but finding that common ground is so important. But I'd again go back to kind of focusing on the youth voice. We don't need to necessarily speak for them. Let them speak for themselves. It's not up to me to share all of their individual experiences, because one, I don't understand all of their individual experiences, and I'm not going to say it correctly. So how can we help them? If there's a roadblock for them to speak, enable them to speak. Open the doors for them to share their experiences. Help them work on sharing their experiences. Through the QU scholarship, I was so lucky to be a youth mentor for two fantastic youth. My first one was very outspoken, a trans man who I think went to Phoenix College and was so well spoken. I didn't need to do anything for him to enable him to open his voice. And the second student that I had the benefit of working with transitioned while I knew her, and the transformation was magical. Super quiet when I first met this student, and then after she had transitioned, just so eloquent in sharing her experience, and just never even mentioned it to me before, but enabling her with a new set of mentors that she asked for. You know, she wanted to know other professionals in a certain field of profession that had transitioned, and that's how I connected her. It wasn't now my job to explore and help educate on what it's like being a transgender female, because I can't share that experience. I don't know, but I can certainly enable you to empower yourself with these resources and help you share what your experience was for you. And I think it's the same with other issues that was going on in the community. How do we help these youth tell their stories so that they're heard, so that others can listen to them, and that we can all be better off and learn and grow because of them?
Love that. And I think that to sum that up, not entirely, but in one word, is amplification. And as you stated, Tyler, you can't speak for someone. You don't know their story. You don't know, everything about their past and where they come from, but you can help amplify their voice. And I think that's so critical, particularly at a time like today. Superintendent Hoffman, any final words on this question?
Yeah, I would say kind of two things. First, my hope for the future, my vision for this would be, I know in speaking with parents of LGBTQ youth, or specifically even speaking with parents that are part of the organization TYPO, the Trans Youth Parent Organization, that there's still a lot of fear for parents in choosing a school and worrying about their child's safety when they know that their child is a part of the LGBTQ community. And so I hope in the future we can get to a place, hopefully not too distant future, where parents are not so worried about the safety of their children because of their sexual orientation, and where we have positive school cultures in every school, so that this is not an ongoing concern that I know we've even had parents move out of state because they just were having such a struggle finding a good school environment that was meeting their child's needs. But then the second thing I want to share on a more positive note of what I'm seeing in our youth is I do have a student advisory council that's made up of 5th through 12th graders. And we knew going in, because it was part of our application form, we asked for preferred pronouns. And one of the students who we accepted into the council had indicated they preferred the pronouns they, them, their. And so then when we had our very first meeting with the council, as we did introductions, we included that as part of our introductions to ask, please share your pronouns. And I know we had youth from all over the state, again, as young as 5th grade. So I know for some of the youth, the student advisors, this was really a new, kind of like, why are you asking me this? And concept, and there was some modeling of that. And but what I got into the meeting, once we got into the meeting and people were the students were in conversations and we were having different discussions as a group, I noticed one of the students self-correct herself, where at first she said something where she said him or he, but then she realized and she said, oh, I mean them. And I saw her self-correct. And so I think that that's one of my other visions for the future for our LGBTQ youth is that openness and that adaptability of that we're like exactly what Tyler was saying and Dr. Johnson, of it shouldn't even be a big deal. It's just getting to know each other, and we all have unique differences. So I hope that these youth continue on that path as well.
Thank you, Superintendent Hoffman. And we've had a number of questions come in around the same theme. So I'm going to select this one that I think really sums it up the best. And Kathy, I've heard you speak on this on NPR and other formats, but so I know you're ready for it. But how do we continue to move the conversation forward for sex ed for all in public schools after the repeal of no promo homo, where we're seeing that some districts are electing not to teach it, other districts are trying to implement new curriculum? How do we move that conversation forward? Yeah,
that was the hot topic before COVID-19, that we had all hands on deck and trying to move that conversation forward. To me, this is also a conversation about student safety and making sure that that all students have access to accurate, high quality, research-based information that is medically accurate. We know there's a lot of misinformation out there, especially on Facebook and on the internet, where there's just a lot of misinformation and a lot of fear that is being spread about this issue. But at the end of the day, we want our youth to be well informed, to be educated in a way where they can make safe decisions for themselves. So that ultimately is the concern. So I know that those conversations they've been very difficult conversations, especially with our legislature currently, with the current make. So I know we may have challenges ahead in this area and thinking about this at the state level, but I would encourage people to really think about what this looks like at the local level, at the school board level, because it's at that level where decisions are made about curriculum. And so that's where you can be more involved and have your voice heard, hopefully at the more local level. But it has been challenging as of lately at the state level.
Yeah, and another question asked what legal hurdles are there, and you hinted at that. And I know in this last most recent legislative session, we saw, I don't know if you know the number of bills, but I know it was quite a few pertaining to this topic specifically. So clearly there are legal hurdles. Clearly there will be additional attempts to challenge it. But I love your point about using our voice at the local level in our school boards. I think many citizens have never been to a school board meeting, and by and large, they're not that interesting. However, it is your opportunity to affect the policies and, as you said, the curriculum of the people that you're electing for your school board in your neighborhood. So I think that is so key. Let's see. We had lots of questions along that line, and so I apologize if I didn't quite summarize all of them in that one question, but thank you, Superintendent, for speaking to it. One other question for you, Superintendent, is are there opportunities, or what opportunities exist to strengthen acceptance of LGBTQ peers for both students and staff within our state school system? And we'd also like to hear from you, Dr. Johnson, as it pertains to post-secondary ed.
Well, I think we made huge gains in that area last year when we collectively finally repealed the No Promo Homo law, because previous to that, I know a lot of educators felt very fearful or felt that they were not allowed to have conversations in their classrooms that could be perceived in the wrong way, that they wanted to be more inclusive or have books, for example, but that might have same-sex parents, that type of thing, but they were very anxious and fearful about that. But now that has been repealed, I've talked to educators who do feel just a sense of relief that they can speak openly and be inclusive language, because really that language piece matters. The words we use and our behaviors around these issues, even in the classroom when the youth are still forming their ideas and learning about life, those words really matter. So I think that was a huge step in the right direction. And we continue. I love the work that GLSEN does. Everyone knows I'm a huge supporter of that work, of how can we make this about having safe, positive cultures for all kids, where all kids feel safe. And I really love that language as well.
I love that too. And I think, we have to mention this. We just received a small, Supreme Court decision here, not so small, protecting our employees from discrimination on the basis of being LGBTQ. And so that's certainly a huge step forward. Dr. Johnson, how have you or the Maricopa County Community College District helped to protect LGBTQ staff and gain more acceptance, as well as students? Is there anything being done there?
So that's a good question, Nate. So while I'm not the authority of the Maricopa Community College District or its board, I will say personally, as an empathetic and a servant leader, I work very diligently to ensure that all voices have an opportunity to share, and to share in a way that, it may make some uncomfortable in their sharing of information, but because our faculty have academic freedom, they have the flexibility to engage with their peers and also with their students around very controversial topics, and they do. They do that often, and I support them in doing that, because if we are not able to have those difficult conversations, we cannot progress as a community. And if we're preparing tomorrow's leaders, we must be willing to have those difficult exchanges so that our students can be civically engaged. So as a leader, of an institution that is predominantly minority, it's incumbent upon me to make sure that I'm championing that everyone has a voice, that our persons are at the table, including our students, and that they are a part of just, I would say, the ecosystem and the decisions that are being made at the institution. So with the current legislation that just happened on yesterday, I think that will help to empower many of our faculty, our staff throughout higher education to be a little bit more intentional about those conversations. They may be a little bit more intentional about how they're reviewing and assessing their curriculum to be more open and more flexible to engaging in those courageous conversations, especially around the LGBTQ plus community. So again, as an individual, I certainly applaud the work that's being done, and every day I support that. We should all have an equal playing at the table, and we should all be able to engage in conversations where there's equity for all persons.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. And I wanted to also shoot over to Tyler for a second, because I know, Tyler, in your line of work, you practice employment law. So these cases can land on your desk. What is your recommendation to employers, to the schools, of what they can do before it gets to that point, especially now that we have the protections? So I'm guessing that we'll start to see the litigation follow suit.
Certainly, and we already have. I mean, these cases were already moving forward under sex-based discrimination. I handled about 5 where I represent employees in employment matters, where employees who were LGBTQ and terminated or discriminated against and retaliated against based on that. And so, it's great for an employer as a whole, or a school system as a whole, to have these policies. But you need to provide the information and the resources where, if someone is facing that type of discrimination, they can move forward and seek help safely. It's kind of a joke sometimes on the plaintiff side of things, or the employee side of things, of, well, I went to human resources. If the organization itself doesn't empower the human resources to truly act non-biased, not on the employer's behalf, but to find the truth of what's going on and to assist the employee, then you're not going to have that safe type of work environment. So you need to provide a resource through human resources where someone can come through, file a complaint, have it investigated fairly, and protect that employee or that student from retaliation. Because more retaliation complaints come down than actual discrimination complaints, where someone files this type of complaint and now they're the problem child, or now they're the problem employee, and then they're essentially marched out. They need to feel safe. They need to enter, the employer needs to collaborate and investigate and provide that open door policy where they can truly find answers and solutions. And even if this discrimination is unfounded, or you say, okay, we discipline this employee or the bad actor, so to speak, that both parties can move forward safely and, again, free from retaliation. Because until you provide a work environment that is going to encourage and require that, it's unfortunate, but sometimes you're not going to have it. That type of discriminatory treatment will creep in, as we've all likely heard about and seen.
Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, and we just had a comment in the chat. Teachers knowing they cannot be fired for being gay are more likely to help students. Help equals listen, refer, reflect. And I think that is certainly important. We also had another question, and they may have missed when we were talking about social workers and the social worker ratio in the schools, or maybe they just want to underscore it, but asking, is it really the right move to legally mandate to train teachers on suicide prevention when teachers have so much that's going on? And really the answer is the counselor teacher-student ratio. So more students in the classroom, fewer social workers in the school. What are we doing, or is there anything we're doing from a funding mechanism that you're aware of, Superintendent Hoffman, from the state level? Obviously, educational funding has been a hot topic here in Arizona for several years and needs to continue to be, I believe, but is there anything being done to increase that funding level and truly bring more social workers into the school and not put all of that burden on our teachers?
There was a lot in there and that to address. So first of all, I do think it's a good idea to train teachers in suicide prevention because it's something we should all take responsibility for. What we're planning to do, even for the Department of Education, we haven't started this yet because of, unfortunately, COVID-19 derailed some of our plans, but we actually are planning on doing suicide prevention training for our entire agency. That's how important we think it is, because it's really for everyone, that every community member, every educational professional should be empowered with that knowledge on how to prevent suicide. It's critical and it impacts every single community. In terms of the school counselors and social workers, we have made really good gains. Like I mentioned before, last year we got $20 million of additional funding that went through the school safety grant program, and that was expanded to fund school counselor and social worker positions in our schools last year. However, we had over 1,000 requests for school safety positions last year, and that funding was only sufficient for 383 of the requested positions statewide, and that includes all types of school positions. So we clearly have more work to be done in that area. Prior to COVID-19, we were actually working very closely with lawmakers and the governor as well, because that is an area of good collaboration, of bipartisan agreement, that we need more funding for these positions. And I was actually optimistic that we would receive the additional $45 million to fully fund those requests. So the over 1,000, well, I guess it'd be about 800 remaining positions that needed funding, that we had good momentum to get that extra $45 million. Then COVID-19 hit, legislature stopped, they recessed, they stopped their session. So a lot of our education bills, we also had a bill moving forward to increase funding for special education services. There were multiple types of school funding bills that were actually moving forward, that because of what happened with COVID-19, that was actually something quite devastating for me, was seeing the impact of some of the things we were really excited about. I will say that we've also been working to allocate the CARES Act funding to our schools, because I know there's a lot of concern right now about school funding, since we know there's a state deficit of it's estimated over $1 billion state deficit with the current economic downturn. However, we do have the rainy day fund available to our legislature. And so we do feel actually in a more cautiously optimistic place that we will not need to make any cuts to our school budgets. And then we're using CARES Act funding to supplement the current budgets, which for K-12 education is $277 million that will be allocated out to it's already actually in the process of being allocated out to our schools for COVID-related expenses. So I know there's a lot, but that's a good, I think a quick brief update of where we're at in terms of school funding for this year and under these current circumstances.
And I do not envy you in everything that you're having to handle there, and really with everybody. COVID-19, as you mentioned several times, has just changed the playing field here in every which way, and no one has that crystal ball to know exactly what the months ahead are going to bring, and when we'll have that vaccine. So we have just a few minutes left. I wanted to give you each just a minute or two to give us a closing bit. We'll go to Tyler first, if that's okay, Tyler.
Sure. Yeah, just from my perspective, I just want to encourage everybody to speak out. Conversations change opinions, they change stances. I know Nate's heard my story, but when there's a movie called Boy Erased that came out, and I saw the movie, and I had literally forgotten that I had been through conversion therapy for 5 years. You just block it out, you move on, you know, and that's what I did. And I saw this movie and it really triggered me. And I decided, you know, we have to do something. I sent an email to my state senator, and who's a Republican and an amazing woman. And she agreed to meet with me about it. Right when we got together for a coffee, she said, you know, Tyler, I love you, but I can't support this. And I said, well, do you know what this is? And she said, no. And she met with me for 2 hours and had tears in her eyes and said, we will fight this. The next morning at 4 a.m., I had 2 emails from her. You know, she had clearly been thinking about it, and she did. She co-sponsored the legislation. She was passionate about it. She's gotten meetings with me with very key influential people to listen, and she cares. And that would never have happened had I not asked to speak with her. Not demanded that she do X, Y, and Z, but ask to speak with them. Share your personal experiences. Share why it matters. Don't yell at them. Tell them that they're horrible. Tell them that they're wrong. Have the conversation and enable, like I said, enable the youth to have their conversations. It's so important, and it really makes a difference.
Yeah, speaking that truth, it truly changes hearts and minds, and it's how we, in the beginning parts of the LGBTQ movement, made that possible and did it one person at a time through our personal networks. So, thank you, Tyler, and thank you for being here today and offering us your expertise, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Nate, so much for that. And Tyler, I want to just build upon what he said. It's the narrative. We have to not only tell the narrative, but we have to be very strategic in how we are approaching the narrative, because when you engage with your congressperson or legislature, and because they saw you coming, there was automatically, okay, it's a gay issue, and I am part of this party affiliation, so I can't deal with it. And I think that we have to be a little bit more strategic around how we position ourselves to tell the narrative. And that's one of the things I would say I love about Angela Hewitt with One Community, because she's very strategic in understanding how to tell the story and not to just overwhelm and overshadow persons with saying, well, you know, this is who we are and we want you to become like us. And it's not about that. It's about telling the story in such a compelling way wherein persons that will have that catharsis, that cleansing, because they may not be the same with sexual orientation, but they understand what it feels like to not be liked. They understand what it feels like to have their rights violated. They understand when someone said something bad to them one day, how it made them feel. And I think when we get to the hearts and the minds of leaders and legislators and other persons who we want to be allies, I think then that's when the real work begins. So I'm hopeful that through this dialogue and through many dialogues to come, that we really utilize this time where we've had to really take a step back and pause to really reflect upon and really take that introspective look at who are we, what are our values, and how can we now use our influence to really change the trajectory of these young LGBTQ plus students' lives.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and you hit it so on the nail with no matter what side of the aisle we are on, we have shared values. And so if we can speak from a standpoint of values, there's so much more to be gained. Thank you for being on here today. Superintendent Hoffman, any final words?
Well, first, I absolutely loved what Tyler and Dr. Johnson just said, so thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. And I just want to echo some of the things we've already touched on, that I think that under these current circumstances, this is a good time for us to be reflecting about the future of education, the way it's structured, thinking innovatively. And so I think this is a unique moment in history where we can really be reflective and think about what that looks like in the future going forward, and thinking about what our priorities are as a community. And I've been strongly advocating in the recent months, recent weeks, about how our schools can be a part of the solution going forward, because they are such critical supports for our communities. And so I look forward to continuing that collaboration across all areas with of course, great organizations like 1 in 10 and GLSEN, but also thinking about our other state agencies, other nonprofit organizations, businesses, that we can all come together thinking about what the future of education looks like. And but I also wanted to make sure to mention Our website has lots of COVID-19 resources for families, educators, students. And if you have any questions about the trainings I mentioned, like if you're interested in the suicide prevention trainings or those types of resources, if any questions come up, you can reach out through our constituent services office. Their email is questions@azed.gov.
Thank you, Superintendent Hoffman. And I'd like to say a special thank you to One Community and Angela Huey and their team for including all of us here in their Point of Pride 2020 Business Inclusion Summit. Clearly a different summit than past years, but still just as powerful. And in closure, I wanted to read some of what Julie posted in the chat. And she closed us out with saying, I'm hopeful that our students and employees can be supported to be free to participate in meaningful change to benefit humanity. And I think that's one thing we all can agree upon. Thank you all for being part of this panel today, and have a fantastic rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nate.